If you have SOLIDWORKS Professional or a higher package, then you have the Toolbox and Toolbox Browser. Alternatively, if you've also purchased the Toolbox as a standalone package, you'll also be able to add it in. Right now I have a blank assembly open, and I'm just going to come into the add-ins, and on the active side we'll choose the Toolbox and the Toolbox Browser. And of course, if you use these pretty much every time that you use SOLIDWORKS, you'll want to open these up on startup as well. Now that we have it added in, you'll see the Toolbox pull down and several tools to look through. But the most important thing in this pull down is the configure option. And this is all for your setup of your toolbox. Now, depending on what you're working on, you may or may not need a lot of these standards. For example, I might only need the ANSI inch, and I'm on the first setting, which is the hole wizard. So if I uncheck all of the other standards, and once you have selected which items to include, you can also go into these folders and choose which size holes that you want to include as well. You can also come in for this hole wizard section and change the default sizes here. So if you've worked with the hole wizard, you know there's a custom sizing option. As opposed to using that, if you're going to use the same sizing over and over, you can change it right here within the toolbox. If we go onto our second tab, we can customize our hardware. Once again, we can uncheck any boxes we don't need. And we can also come into these folders and customize some of the properties of the component. So all the dimensions in this case are going to stay at the standard, but we can assign part numbers, descriptions, as well as a comment for these components. And that makes it easier if you use components quite frequently and have a part number assigned to them. These will populate automatically in your bill of materials if you want, as well as in the custom properties. And once again, obviously, we can choose to include or disclude any items that we want. Once you're done with customizing your hardware, you can come into the user settings. And this pertains to how items are created. By default, if you drag in a toolbox component, it's going to create a configuration of the part. And so it's just going to reference directly to the toolbox without creating a new part. That means there won't be any extra fasteners or extra toolbox items within your assembly folder, and so that's one thing you may or may not want. Alternatively, if you want the parts to show up on or in your assembly folder or in another folder, you can choose the Create Parts option. This will also still regenerate the component using the toolbox, but you'll have an individual part that's referenced. And you can also choose, this is the same option as Create Parts, except it'll create a part on Control Drag, and it'll create a configuration if you just drop the component in. If you do choose the Create Parts option, you'll have to create a folder to add the components into. There's also a few other options you can go through here. I won't go into too much detail on them. They're relatively self-explanatory. Then there's the Set Permissions tab. If you're using this toolbox locally, this generally isn't necessary. You can create a password if you want so that no one else using your toolbox can change the settings, but that tends not to be the case. This permissions becomes useful. I'll come in and set this as Toolbox. So this permissions, as I was saying, becomes useful when you're sharing a toolbox between quite a few different people. So if you're using a shared toolbox on a server, you'll probably have one place where all the files are saved, and you're not going to want to allow a lot of these. For example, editing the components or editing the custom properties. You might want to allow adding parts to the toolbox, as that won't interfere with assemblies that you already have created. And you may or may not want to allow editing part numbers. And once again, if you're sharing it, you probably don't want to allow a change to the file name. And you can set this separately for each user or the same for all users. And the same is true of the Smart Fastener options. I'm going to go ahead and remove this for myself, as I'm the only one using my toolbox. And there's several options for the Smart Fasteners. For washer sizes, the Smart Fasteners tool will try to choose the best fit for a washer, so you can choose a couple options here to change how it determines what the fit is going to be. If you are using nuts on your bolts, you can choose to have the fastener update its length to make sure you have enough threads. For example, if you wanted 2 threads to show beyond the nut, then this option would do that. And then you can choose a fastener to use with non-hole wizard holes, although this is probably not an option that you'll use because you're going to use different sized fasteners for non-hole wizard holes anyways. You'll have quite a few different hole sizes if you're doing it that way. Once you're done with that, you'll want to save your toolbox. And generally this should save. I have some sort of access control setting problem right now, as I've been having a bit of an issue with my toolbox. But generally you should just be able to save as it just did there. And once you've saved your toolbox, you can go ahead and exit out.